Marisa, I'm the newest analyst with the on-site wastewater program. Previously, you guys had Dave Cotton over here. He's the program engineer now, and I took over his former area. So area stayed the same. If you had Dave Cotton, you now have me. So just to make it clear. So yeah, let's get going. So the agenda here is we're going to talk about the Michigan criteria for subsurface sewage disposal. So we'll get into it, but mostly non-residential systems will be designed under this, and that's how we will be kind of reviewing these case studies, because we don't really know what your code says. So we're not going to really try to evaluate your systems that are designed under your code. So we're going to talk about the regulatory structure. As some of you know, it can be very complicated. We'll have then a little overview of how to do a plan review. I do not have the intention to teach you how to do a plan review. We kind of discussed that, and it seems like you'd have to do a whole workshop on it, probably a day or two, talking about plan review. So it's more so, talking about what we do, and then we'll have case studies kind of showing some of the things that we look at, and then finally wrap it up. Okay, so let's get into the Michigan criteria for subsurface sewage disposal. So the Michigan criteria applies to systems anything other than single or two family. So a non-residential in this case, we're talking about anything that is not a single or two family system. So if you're talking about an AFC home, though they may be kind of residential, adult foster care, this rule still applies to them. They are not a single family home. It is adopted in the Water Resources Division Part 22 groundwater quality rules. So this is important. It's not there by itself. It's not its own regulation. It's adopted within the Water Resources Division rules. And this is the portion that it's in. It's in 2210, items permitted to be discharged without a permit. So that's important to understand, because if you do not have a permit issued under the local code or the Michigan criteria, you are not permitted to discharge without a Water Resources Division permit. So it's either this or that, right? Either you have a permit from the health department or you have a WRD permit. So local health departments are contracted with the state of Michigan to write permits for up to 10,000 gallons per day. When systems are below 1,000 gallons per day, they can be designed under local code or the Michigan criteria, depending on kind of the code and the situation. We'll get more into that. Regina kind of talked about this at the on-site wastewater conference a little more in depth. It gets complicated with the less than 1,000 gallons per day systems because every code is a little bit different in Michigan. So where your code is very clear about it, it says we adopt our local code below 1,000 gallons per day, and you have provisions for it. That's important. You actually have things to design non-residential systems. Then go ahead and follow your local code. If your code says follow the Michigan criteria for subsurface sewage disposal, follow the Michigan criteria for subsurface sewage disposal. And that includes site suitability, not just the provisions of the code designing it. Where your code is silent, unclear, adopts local code but does not have provisions for non-residential systems, or only adopts portions of the criteria, we recommend you seek guidance from our program on the on-site wastewater program to kind of discuss what you should be doing. It is different for every county or every health department. So, okay, what is the scope of the Michigan criteria? So the Michigan criteria only covers sanitary sewage. It's specifically stated in 2210, sanitary sewage. So where there's commingled waste, they are not exempt from a discharge permit. So what do we mean by commingled waste? Is anything that is not these: bathroom, kitchen, household laundry, right? So if you're talking floor drains, commercial laundry waste, industrial commercial processing waste, they are not exempt from a discharge permit, and they're not covered under the Michigan criteria. So know that. Okay, some of the general requirements of the criteria. So all our new or increased uses have to follow all the provisions of this code. So that means if you have a church and they want to do a huge addition to it, they now have to meet all the provisions of this code, including having a replacement area and suitable site suitability. So they don't get grandfathered in anymore at that point. Next, connecting municipal sewer is required. So we know this gets kind of dicey in some areas, but the criteria is pretty clear about it. Where it's within availability, which is defined as within 200 feet in most areas. Some municipalities are further, so you might want to know that. It has to be connected. Where it's in question, the municipality that controls the sewer has to write a letter stating the facts of the availability. So essentially, they have to state it is not available in order for you to write a permit for under the Michigan criteria. So. And this is an important one that we are really trying to drive home today, and Dave will talk about it even more in the next presentation. Construction plans are required to be submitted by an engineer, a PE, or an REHS RS in private practice for all plans. Where it is greater than $15,000 in cost, it has to be a Michigan PE. This can be waived by the health department where there's less than 2,000 gallons per day, and the cost is below $15,000. So if it is above 2,000 gallons and or above $15,000, there needs to be plan stamped by an engineer. Do we have a question? Yeah, I'll have time for questions at the end. Okay. So. Oh yeah, no. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Okay, system design. So these are some of the key factors. Obviously, there's a lot more to it. We actually have copies, hard copies of the criteria you guys can grab on your way out if you'd like. So it's designed with peak flow. So if you're talking about a church system, you're designing for Sunday. You're not designing for the average flow over the week. The reason for that is you want it to be able to handle the peak flow. If the system is above 2,000 gallons per day, it has to be pumped. That is stated in the criteria. It doesn't state that it has to be pressurized. However, that is the more preferable method, in our opinion. So it's probably the easiest way to go. So there also must be a suitable reserve area, provided that it does not impact the original system. So it can't be a replacement area in the area of the original system. They cannot touch. So, and this does not apply to replacement systems. So say you're designing something as a replacement and it's not a new or increased use, you don't have to look for a reserve area. You can, but it's not a requirement. The Michigan criteria requires a 48-inch separation to water table or limiting layer, meaning like clay or water table. So this is different in different state rules. So where more than one rule applies, such as you're in a subdivision and it's a non-residential subdivision. Subdivisions require 36 inches. Criteria requires 48. You're going to follow this one. So 48 inches of separation. And finally, the soil loading rates vary depending on soil type and the design of the system. So where the system has higher BOD, your soil loading rate is not going to be the same as a residential system. So finally, there are considerations for waste strength in Appendix F, which is at the end of the criteria. Dave is going to be talking about that a little bit more. But if you're doing a waste strength restaurant, you're not looking at the loading rates for the rest of the systems for residential strength. It's not the same. Okay, so variances of the criteria. Variances can only be considered where the criteria cannot be met. So where they can meet it, they cannot get a variance. The variance request can also not be had if there's more acceptable alternatives. So say they want to size the system down because they don't have enough space. Well, the acceptable alternative is that they could use alternative treatment and meet the sizing requirements. So they may not get that variance. And then it also cannot create a health hazard or nuisance condition or pollute the surface or groundwater. The request must come in writing to the health department, and it can only be issued by the Director of Environmental Health. The health department comes to our program at the Eagle On-Site Wastewater to consult and see if we agree. and this does not set a precedent. So say we issue a variance to isolation to water table for one, does not mean we're going to do it for everything. It's all dependent on the permit. And finally, appeals. And this is an important one, something we learned not everybody understands or knew. All appeals of non-residential systems other than single and two family come to the state of Michigan. Does not matter if they were designed under local sanitary code below 1,000 gallons a day, comes to the state of Michigan. And that's in the code. And the way that they appeal is by submitting a permit application to WRD Part 22 in My Waters. Sounds kind of weird, but basically, because they can't get a permit from you under 2210, they have to get a discharge permit. And this is the regulatory structure. It is complicated. This, by all means, does not say everything about the regulatory structure. But we have an explainer. We have copies of it here for you guys to grab. It's 10 pages long, so that tells you how complicated the regulatory structure is in Michigan. So, but this is as basic as I can make it. Local health departments cover single family and two family homes. They also cover all non-residential systems of sanitary sewage up to 10,000 gallons per day. Part 22 handles non-residential waste or non-sanitary waste, as well as systems above 6,000 gallons per day. Notice that overlap. And then Part 41, they're a fun one to try to understand, but they are sewerage systems, meaning systems that serve more than one owner. So if you have a duplex that's a condominium owned, so not a true duplex, and they share a system, that is a Part 41 system. Two owners, and they need a Part 41 permit. So it's important to know, community systems, essentially. Okay, on to the plan review basics. The first thing you want to know is, what's the authority here? Before you review anything, you want to know, what rules am I applying? Who's in charge? What's the basis of design? Because the basis of design will determine the review of the plans. So those are your 3 steps. While determining authority, you want to think first, what rules am I applying? This is really important because, again, we've talked about how all rules are not the same. And sometimes there's overlap. You just have to know, which ones am I applying here first? And sometimes that's the hardest part. So, and who has authority? Are we talking, is it me? Do I even have authority at the local health department? That's a good question to ask. Is it processing waste? Is it commingled? Because then the answer is no, and then you should not be writing permit. Is Eagle WRD Part 22 involved? Are we above 6,000 gallons per day? Or do they have a processing waste somewhere on the site? Is there Eagle Part 41? Is this owned by more than one owner? Is this single ownership? And then there's some other random state agencies like Materials Management Division. They handle hazardous wastes. We don't expect you guys to know every division. It's really kind of impossible. But you should question, like, if it's not sanitary waste, who is it then? And sometimes that's just coming to us and then we kind of figure it out. We don't even really know all the time who we need to talk to, and it kind of takes a tracking down. And then also you want to talk about the water supply. It's not our program area on on-site wastewater, but we would be remiss not to mention that they are kind of changing the way that they review classifications. So it's something to think about. What used to be, this is 14 homes and we're good to do a type 3, might not be the case anymore. So you want to come to community water supply and you need to ask them, what's a well classification? Because they have the authority to classify wells. And then finally you want to ask, do I need a variance? Because if you do, you're asking if you need to talk to one of us. Come to our program, discuss a variance, and send us as much as you can, which is helpful. Hopefully you like the meme. Okay, so the basis of design is arguably the most important part here. If you don't get this right, the rest of it's not going to be right. So design flow, what did they use? Did they use comparable data? Did they use table 1 from the criteria, which is right here? Does it make sense? So the Michigan criteria prefers that you use comparable data. That's the first go. Do you have systems that are very similar, that has data, you can change it up and down depending on how comparable they are. If you don't have comparable data, that's when you go to something like this, where you're estimating, an airport per passenger 2.6 gallons per day. It's not very accurate, which is why we prefer real data, but we understand that's hard to come by sometimes. Next, you're looking at soil type. What soil type do we have? Is it residential or high strength? What are the linear loading rates if you're talking about the draft criteria, which I'm not talking about today, but that comes up in some situations. You want to avoid groundwater mounding, right? What area is totally provided? What are they providing to meet the sizing that you need to have? And then how much tank capacity, and are they putting alternative treatment in? Are they giving reduced size due to alternative treatment? That's all got to be in there. Okay, plan review checklist. So obviously this is not all encompassing. This is just kind of the things we roughly look at. We also do not have this in a PDF form to provide to you, but I'm assuming most health departments have already created their checklist for plan review, and it probably looks a lot like this, right? You look at the septic tanks, you want to look at what are they? What material? Inlet, outlet elevations, do they have baffled T's? Do they have effluent filters? Do they have risers? Do they have safety grates for those risers? Do they have a control panel? Is there anything electrical? And in the pump chamber, you want to look at the volume, the depth of the pump. That's important. Something I didn't really know to look at until I met Dave Cotton. The height of the floats. This is very important. This is telling you your dose volume. And then do they have check valve anti-siphon devices? And then you're getting the pump. Do you have the pump selection? Do you have the total dynamic head gallons per minute that they need? And then what is their dose volume? And does that make sense? And then obviously this is much longer, but final disposal area, primary and reserve area. Is it consistent with what they said they were going to provide to you? The delivery line manifold lateral size, length, what is it made of? Orifice size and locations, those should be noted on the plans. And then what are the depth of laterals, trench width, and spacing? And then elevations are very important here. What is the system depth? The Michigan criteria only allows for 24 inches of depth. It's not very much, and it's probably less than your local code. So, and then do they have enough fall? Like, are they only giving you 1.5 inches fall between inlet and outlet when it needs to be 4 inches? So those are important things to look at. And then isolations, finally. You guys know, that's probably the first thing you look at, like how far away are they from the well? Okay, finally into case studies. I love this picture, because obviously you need to wear hard hats and a suit while you're reviewing plans. So that's very important. Okay, so case study 1. This is an interesting one, which is obviously why I picked it. It's a marijuana growing and processing facility with no retail outlet. So it's not like a store people come and buy marijuana. This is where they're growing it and processing it. And their peak gallon flow design is 1,250 gallons per day. So it's over that 1,000 gallons. So where's the authority in this one? So this is for the sanitary sewage that they applied for. So this is under the health department jurisdiction. So it's below 10,000 gallons per day, it's sanitary sewage, and so they will be writing a permit. The question here too, though, is what about those floor drains? Is it the RRD? Is it WRD? Is it MMD? Answer is potentially. So this was referred to WRD to make that determination. It was beyond the scope of the health department to determine what they do with their floor drains. And then was it Part 41? No, it's just a single owner and one building, so it's not a Part 41. And then what is the water supply is a good question. It will be an on-site public, so type 2. Okay, so this is the basis of design they provided. This is actually a really nice basis of design. I'm sure you guys do not get them like this all the time. Here they determined it was 1,250 gallons per day. They got that from Table 1. I know I just said that we don't like non-comparables, but I mean, where are they going to get data for a marijuana growing facility? So it's kind of new. So they don't have all that yet. So they used it off of the factory employees on Table 1, 35 gallons per day per employee per shift. So they have 15 employees, 2 shifts, 30 employees total, which actually just gets you to 1050 up here. I don't know if you can see that, it's really small, but they applied a 1.2 peaking factor. That's the engineer's choice. That was not required, but they are certainly allowed to go beyond the scope of the criteria. And in fact, in most cases, they probably should. These are all minimums. They do not have to meet the minimum. So this is a sandy loam, where they sized it based on a sandy loam, which per the criteria is 0.5 gallons per square foot for trenches. So they're doing trenches in a step trench formation here, which I will explain a little bit later what step trenches are in case there's people that do not quite know. And then they were designing it for a 1,500 gallon tank, 1 septic tank, and a 1,000 gallon pump chamber. So I'm just gonna go through here the plans pages that they submitted, and then I will go deeper in so that you can actually see them, because I know that's tiny. So this is page 1. This just shows you the building, the legal description, and then this is all instructions for the installer. Super tiny, so we're not really gonna look over into that, but it's all good. Page 2, this is their grade changes here. So the red is where they're changing it. Obviously they're adding a detention or retention pond over here, and then they're flattening out where their building is gonna be. Not so important because it's not in the area of the septic system. So this is their septic plan. We'll go more into this one for sure. That is the drainage for the Drainage Commission, so we don't really look at that too much. This is the system specifications. So again, we'll be looking closely at that. And then what are step trenches? So that you can understand when I further explain the pump, what I'm talking about. So this is their design here. So they're gonna have 2 trenches per 1 zone. In this case, it's pressurized. So they're going to have a distribution valve that switches and doses 1 zone at a time. So in this case, the pump kicks on, it doses this one. Kicks off, pump kicks on, it doses this one. So this is not the only way that this can be done. Up here is gonna be a gravity flow with drop boxes. That's also feasible, but not in this situation, so. So now that you understand that, we're gonna start at the tanks. I like to start at the beginning and move to the end just to keep it easy to understand. So this is where their tanks are. Obviously this is not very to scale. That's not how tanks are sized, but they said here it's a 1,500 gallon single compartment tank. Criteria requires 24-hour storage where there's no grease. So that does meet the requirement of the criteria. Where the county codes want to require more, they're welcome to do that. And then the dosing tank is 1,000 gallons here. It meets all of the isolation requirements. So that's really what we were looking at in this one. And there you can see where they determined they're going to use a holding tank for their processing waste. It kind of brought up an interesting question because we're like, what do you do with that? Because it's not a discharge. So WRD says then it's not a discharge, they don't need a discharge permit. Well, what do we do? So they will have to have someone come out and do pump and haul basically, and they're gonna have an industrial waste hauler do that. So I'm sure it's not gonna be cheap, but that was their choice. So, all right. Okay, these are the septic system tanks. So we look here, obviously inlet, outlet, risers. They look really deep. They're not as deep as they look. It's like 24 inches. I don't know why the scale looks like that. But we did recommend that they put safety grates in here. It's not a requirement in the code, but it's always smart, and it doesn't add that much in cost. So, safety grates. And then this is their pump here and the control panel. On this, we noticed that they noted, you can barely see it, Kent County Health Department. This is not in Kent County. So, so that was, yeah, so it probably was a carryover. So we, that's just some things that noticed. We're like, hey, what's that? So we did tell them that as well. And then I'm zooming in here to the tank elevations, right? Does this make sense? You see the low level cutoff here at 677.3, the redundant off at 677.2, and then the bottom of the pump at 677.1. So that leaves 0.1 to 0.2 effluent cover over the pump. And the pump usually needs about 20 to 24 inches of cover. So that's hardly enough. In this case, they will most likely have to have a bigger pump tank just for that reason, because they're going to, we did the math, I don't think they're going to have enough effluent between here and here, even if they drop it, to get that full coverage. That, or they're going to have a different design pump tank, because in this case, I think they're just using a standard 1,000-gallon. Pump chambers are usually like deeper and not as wide, so they'll have to fix that. Oh, yeah. All right. This is the pump select that they provided to us. I know you can't see it. I will be zooming in. The first thing we're going to look at is the parameters here. Like, are these making sense in their plan? So 2-inch line, 261 feet, that all adds up. You can see here also the distribution valve model. So 6404 means that it has 4 manifolds. So that's important to know. And they have 8 laterals. I mentioned that they have 2 laterals per zone, and they're going to have 4 zones. So that's 8 laterals total. This pump select does automatic math when you have the distribution valve model entered. So there's 4 manifolds, 8 laterals. It does the math that there's 2 per zone. So that is very helpful. We also want to look at the flow differential here. You don't want to exceed 10%. So it's 5.2%. What we mean by that is that the first orifice and the last orifice only have a 5% difference between them in pressure. So if you have more than 10, then it's not really true even distribution. Do it. Okay, there we go. So next year we're looking at the loss through the valve. So you just want to make sure that they included this at all. So obviously it automatically did this because they have a hydrocheck valve in here. That's where they lost most of their head. I would think that you'd be most concerned if this was all zeros. If it has anything in here and they counted for all the 90s, it'll come out. So, and then here, this is important. This is the volume of the pipes. It automatically calculated that for them in this pump select. And so what this means is before and after the valve. So before the valve is that delivery line, and then after the valve is the distribution area, the actual drain field. We'll talk about that on the next page as well. And then this is the pump select curve. So the red point is the system point. So this is what it needs to meet to get all these parameters that it needs to meet for the dose volume. And then all these black lines are what they selected, the series they selected. So they're not going to pick all of these pumps. They actually, I think, picked this one, which is appropriate. All of these curves meet what needs to be met. All right, so now we're going to look at the dose volume, and then we're going to bring in what I talked about last time. So you're looking at before and after the valve. Does this make sense, and is it appropriate? So they're saying 396.5 gallon dose. You're like, does that make sense? So we want to talk about, you want to dose 5 times the distribution network. So we're not talking the entire system. We're talking just the actual field. What we missed here, or what they missed here, was that they didn't note if there was going to be a weep hole, anti-siphonage device. So this is asking, do they have to fill that delivery line every single time the pump kicks on? The reason you'd want an anti-siphon device, if you guys don't know, is that if your pump, for whatever reason, is below the elevation or above the elevation of your system, so the pump is up high and your drain field is down low, but you're pumping it, you want to have an anti-siphon device just in case it siphons it out, just like someone trying to steal gas from your gas tank. They pull out the gas and then it just siphons out the whole gas tank. Well, that'll happen to your pump chamber. So that's why they'd want it. In this case, it's not necessarily required because their pump is below the elevation of the system. But they didn't say whether they did or didn't. So the math here is if, yes, you have to fill the lines every single time, you want to do, this is 33.8 volume for the distribution network, times 5 doses of the system, and then just add the delivery line. And that gives you a 214.5 gallon dose. So they may have overdone it a little bit. And if they don't need to fill it every time, which in this case, I don't think that they did because they buried the lines below frost level, which wouldn't have been necessary if it drained back. It would only be a 169 gallon dose. So, about 1/3 of what they're planning for. So in this case, they need to reevaluate their dose volume. And then also, this is not showing the zones. as I talked about, they're using this Hydrotech valve. It has 4 manifolds. So it should show, basically 4 headers, 4 different delivery lines. And it shows 1. So if you handed this to an installer, would they know what they're supposed to do? Maybe, if they've done it before, maybe not. So, we'll just tell them, you need to fix that. Same thing here. Just showed 1 delivery line. Should show 4, 1 to each zone that they're dosing here. They do appropriately note it here that they're doing 2 laterals per dose, but it's just not very clear. Another small mistake we found here, why are these different? These are supposed to show the distance between the orifices here. And this is another thing we think is a leftover from one of their original plans. They were going to do 6-foot centers. And so someone just forgot to fix it. So these are the soil borings. I'm not sure why they're light gray. It just appears like that on all of their plants. So I will make it more clear to you here. So test bit 1 had some fill. So this one wouldn't be appropriate because the Michigan criteria just requires no fill. It has to be native soil. Test bit 4 here is loamy sand. This is the only test bit 2 is the only one that has sandy loam in it. And they sized their whole system for sandy loam. We did mention that to them. We're like, did you want to do some more test holes or did you want to put it in the reserve area? No. So that's fine. They're sizing it for that and honestly probably better off. So, and then one other important thing to note, seasonal high water table at the low end here is 7 feet. So it's pretty close. That's something you're going to have to pay attention to. So looking here, they do say you have to be 4 feet above that seasonal high water table. So if they're following the 24 inches of cover or less, foot of stone, and 4 feet to seasonal water level, that gets you to 7. So they will meet that as long as they're following everything they're supposed to follow. But here, mention I just said 24 inches max, that says minimum. And it's also not where it should be. So this might be more than 2 feet of cover here. So that's something they're going to have to address. Yeah, so, but they do, too far. They do mention it appropriately in other parts of the plans. So I think that probably another typo, maybe? I don't know. Okay, conclusions of case study 1. This is sanitary sewage, so it will be a permit written from that health department. The plan review, we determined that their base of design was acceptable, the location was acceptable, and the materials they used were acceptable. They mostly just have to change the pump design and the dose. They have to say that there's less than 24 inches of cover and probably adjust that cover there, maybe make the trenches a little higher. And they have to show the 4 manifolds. I think that's pretty important. I will note, this is probably the 4th time that they've submitted a plan. So this is plan number 4. So we know it's frustrating to keep sending these back to people, but this is how they learn. This guy is a young engineer, so he's probably really never looked at anything like this. And so he's gonna make mistakes, and it's our job to look at them, not to make them, right? We're not here to write the plans, we're here to just review them. And we looked at it with multiple people. I mean, everyone in our team looked at it. Probably 4 people from the health department looked at it. So we all found different things. This is not something we recommend just one person review a whole plan, because someone else might find something different than you. Where Dave Cotton will find the float elevations being off, I'm going to find the typo that says Kent County. So it's important to teamwork. Case study 2. So this one's not as in-depth as case study 1. Really, they don't actually have a real plan to look at, but you'll see why I picked it. Oakland County. This is in Oakland County, which they said I could say that. They just have this challenge of being very, very condensed there and have every scenario physically possible come to them. So this is a proposed 12-unit, 2-apartment building, so 24 units total, 2 bedrooms each. The design flow is at 3864 gallons per day. They got that number off of table 6.1 from the draft criteria. So we expect when you follow the draft criteria that you follow the draft criteria, all of it. Not just the flow parameters, but the actual design as well. And it's more in depth and more detailed requirements there. The question from the engineer wasn't, review my plans. It was, what is my well classification? And you'll see why he needed to know this before even making any design. And what are the isolation requirements going to be required to that well and to the neighboring wells? So who has authority? Does the local health department? Yes, they do. So this is an apartment building. It's below 10,000 gallons per day. The health department will write a permit. Does WRD? So Part 22 in this case will not, because it's below 6,000 gallons per day. So they will not be involved in it. If at any point it goes above 6,000 gallons average over the year, because they follow average, we follow peak. It could be complicated. But if at any point they're above 6,000 gallons per day average, they would need a discharge permit. So if your discharges increase, it doesn't mean, you know, we got a permit. Theirs is not a construction permit, it's a discharge permit. And Part 41, do they need a Part 41? No, because this is an apartment building. So if they had, you know, everybody owned their unit and it was a condominium unit, yes, they would. The numbers would not change, but suddenly they need a Part 41 permit because they have to determine continuity of service. So they determine not just the construction, but also, you know, what happens, who's going to fix it, that kind of stuff. So water supply. In this case, they came to the Eagle Community Water Supply Program to get a classification. So they'd asked, you know, if we have 2 different wells and both of them serve 1 building, is this going to be a type 3? The answer from them was no, it's going to be type 1. Either way, no matter what you do, you're going to have a type 1. So that determines kind of the rest of this. So what's the basis of the design? Well, I kind of covered this. This is where they got it from, table 6.1 draft criteria. They estimate that it's going to be a medium sand. They actually haven't gone out and done test holes yet. This is a preliminary plan, but they're very close to other soil borings, as you'll note, so it's most likely going to be a medium sand. And then they applied an application rate of 0.7 gallons per day per square foot based on the neighboring lots information for soil. And they have a ton of tankage here, 2,300 gallon tanks, 7 of them. So that's about 16,000 gallons. And then 2 2,500 gallon pump chambers, and then 2 25 80 square foot drain beds, under pressure distribution with Advantex treatment. So they pretty much did not size down for that Advantex treatment. They met what they needed to meet without it. They just included that. Again, designer's choice. They can go beyond what is required, and this is certainly beyond the criteria requirements. Okay, so this is the site. So you can see this here is in the middle. That's the building that they're proposing to build. This is another apartment building. This is a condominium. These are condominiums with a community system, and these are single-family homes. So we'll zoom in. So to the east here, you can see they're changing the property line. This is the system for the neighboring lot, the neighboring apartment building, and they're building this property line around it because it must be on their property, at least partially. And obviously they can't put their type 1 well back here because this is 100, it says 151, very tiny, but 151 feet to that closest property corner. So no well back here, but they do have their septic tanks in the back. And then this is pump chamber going that direction. Okay, so this is to the north. These are attached condominiums with a community system, a sand filter here. This is the property line, or this is the property we're talking about here at the bottom, as well as type 3 wells, because these wells serve more than 1 building. So yeah, where are they gonna put their well? Not right here. So yeah, and then next, also type 1 wells. So where are they gonna put their septic system? Because they're type 1 wells right there. And then this is where they proposed it, the bottom corner of the lot here. What you're dealing with is that community system and all these single family wells. So this brought up an interesting question here, right? This community system has a discharge permit because they are above 6,000 gallons per day. This one, we determined, does not need a discharge permit. So when we talked to Part 22, they said, you know, if this was under 1 ownership, these systems, the groundwater would treat them the same. They're in the same groundwater mound, most likely, based on their distance. So if this was owned by that owner, this would need a Part 22 discharge permit because they are not a different groundwater mound. However, there's no legal grounds to do that because they're on different properties and owned by different people. So that was an interesting conversation to have. You know, and their main concern is probably, well, how far do I have to be from these single family wells? Well, the answer is 50 feet. Sure, you guys know. So, of course, the health department does have the authority to say, hey, we want a proof that this system cannot negatively impact these wells, because that is within the criteria. New systems cannot impact groundwater quality or existing wells. It doesn't say type 1 wells, just wells. So if the health department thought that this was going to be a concern for these wells, they could ask for proof that it wouldn't. So, yeah. So the question remains, where do they put their type 1 well? We don't know yet what they're going to do. This is exactly. So once the community water supply is going to be responsible for determining the isolation, right? So the 200 is the standard. However, community water supply can make that more or less depending on groundwater in the area. So if community water supply comes in here and goes, you know, you don't have very good protection and we want 500-foot isolation, they are SOL. So first things first is the community water supply is to determine what their isolations are going to be. And then they can come up with a more exact plan for the health department to review. And then, yeah, we will see. So the conclusion here is they're going to have a type 1 well. That's what their plan is showing, number of people served. It's going to be a type 1 well. No Part 22 or Part 41 permit as it's currently designed. And the plans need a lot more detail, obviously. They didn't have a reserve area, system specifications, pump design, any of that. But he didn't want to get his cart before the horse, and I get it. And they will need to seek a variance for the use of alternative treatment under the draft criteria. So we treat the draft criteria kind of as a variance process. If you follow the criteria, the draft criteria, you're showing that it's equally or more protective than the current criteria that is in law. And so then we allow it for a variance. So that's really the way that you can use alternative treatment right now. So, and then the wrap up. Local health departments are contracted for up to 10,000 gallons per day. That's important to know. There's no exemption for certain things like maybe campgrounds. It's up to 10,000 gallons per day, you're writing a permit. Otherwise, they're getting a discharge permit. There's multiple reviewing agencies, and sometimes they overlap. Part 22, there's a situation where if it's a community system above 6,000 gallons per day, the health department's writing a permit, Part 22 is writing a permit, Part 41's writing a permit, and they're just going to have 3 permits. That's just how it has been and how it's going to be for now. So, and finally, we're here at the Eagle On-Site Wastewater Program to help support you guys in reviewing these really difficult systems and help you determine, who has authority, who do you need to contact, because we know that it's complicated. Like even people that have been with the state for years and years still struggle to figure out which jurisdictions everybody has sometimes. So, so come to us if you have anything really complicated and you think you need support. So, do we have any questions? Yes.